everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with another in-depth deck guide, this time with 4-color Omnath control, the spiritual sister deck to 4-color elementals. As a friendly reminder, if you do like these in-depth modern guides, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving it a thumbs up, leaving a constructive comment down below, and letting us know what deck you might like to see next. So, as I said, this is kind of the sister deck to 4-color elementals. The main difference is whether you're choosing to play Eldamari's Call and Risen Reef, or if you're choosing to play a little bit more interactive spells. So this version is playing things like Counterspell and Expressive Iteration in some of the slots you might see the Risen Reef Eldamari's Call version that we saw before. A lot of the other cards are the same. You're playing things like Prismatic Ending and March of Otherworldly Light to interact with your opponent's permanents. You're playing the pitch elementals in Solitude and Fury to deal with your opponent's creatures. You're playing Endurance to deal with graveyard-based decks. You're playing Teferi as kind of a catch-all against Cascade decks while also being able to bounce some of your elementals to replay them, also dealing with annoying permanents of your opponents. Omnath, kind of the central hub of the deck. This allows you to get a head-on mana in the mid-game, allows you to recoup life against the aggressive decks, etc. Kind of the Swiss Army knife of the deck overall. Wrenn and Six, when paired with your fetch land and cycling lands, allows you to kind of get ahead on various different things. You can also Besage a bunch of your opponent's stuff if you're against Tron and such. You know, you get to play things like Ice Fang Codal as both a deterrent against opponent's early aggression, also being another draw spell that this deck plays a ton of. You know, it's really kind of hard to beat a deck in the mid to late game that says, draw a card, draw a card, draw a card. And it kind of helps you recoup the loss of your pitch elementals, which these can also be 2-for-1s if you're hard casting them. Expressive Iteration, basically a 2-for-1 beyond turn 2. Then Abundant Growth fixes your mana and also draws you a card. They also banned a card similar to this called Arkham's Astrolabe that used to be played in this deck. And then also playing some copies of Unholy Heat and Lightning Bolt as early interaction, as one of the ways to get under this deck a little bit is to get aggressive in the early game with decks like Burn and such. Playing Ephemerate to pair with all of your ETB creatures, you know, your Ice Fang Codals, your Eternal Witnesses, your Omnaths, your Furies, your Solitudes, also pairs quite nicely with Fairy Time Rattler to be able to control the timing of protecting your creatures. And then beyond that, as far as the mana base, you know, you get to play a bunch of the 4-color mana base, but you still manage to squeeze in an Otawaro and Besage to deal with problematic permanents. And then this deck also gets to play probably a Crucible of Defiance in amongst everything else. And, you know, you're playing a bunch of the new Tri-lands as well as the, you know, the Triomes. And then you're playing, you know, basically one of each shock in those colors. Beyond that, the sideboard, you get to answer a bunch of different things. You know, Emrakul for any decks that try to go over the top of you, whether it be control, mirror matches, etc. This is kind of your go over the top card in a lot of those matchups. 2 copies of Engineered Explosives to deal with anything in the early game, particularly, you know, things like aggressive decks, Burn, Urza Saga tokens, etc. You know, 1-drop, 2-drop creatures, etc. Knight of Autumn, nice catch-all, allows you to deal with problematic artifacts and enchantments. Also can come in and gain life, can also be a beater in some matchups. Endurance helps secure your matchup against things like Living End, which otherwise can be a pretty rough matchup. Then I guess the Moon, this is pretty much here for Amulet, Tron, any of those kind of decks. You can bring it in against other 3-color decks. You know, people may not think you're bringing it in against them because your mana base is so kind of all over the place as it is, but this allows you to kind of catch some people off guard sometimes. Mystical Dispute for any type of blue-based decks, particularly Murktide and such. Meddling Mage is kind of a KO card against decks relying on one card, you know, against Amulet Titan, Living End, etc. Basically decks that are built around one key card resolving. And then Besage's 3 and 4, you know, good against Tron, Amulet, you know, any number of other hate cards you might face against. Torpor being another one that can come in against you. And then finally, you're playing a Yorion pile. You know, if you're already playing all these good cards with ETB abilities, you may as well be playing Yorion, and you really don't lose a lot of consistency with all of the draw 4s that are in this deck. One variant that I wanted to make sure that we covered was a Ragavan version. Ragavan has a bit of a tension with this deck overall. On one hand, it gives you an early threat that forces your opponent to react. It's one of the very few 1-mana plays that's a proactive play. You know, otherwise you're generally not getting on the board until turn 2. So this gives you a threat that your opponent must answer, kind of builds up your mana a little bit while also playing into a bunch of what the rest of the deck is doing. Unholy Heat as a 4-of in this particular build, and obviously we've already talked on Abundant Growth. Spreading Seas, yet another card you can use to interact with your opponent's lands out of Amulet, Tron, Urza's Sagas, etc. Yet another card that plays in the blink abilities of this deck. The rest of the cards, this version is playing a couple copies of Eldamari's Call, but noticeably not playing any Ephemerates in this version, and no Eternal Witnesses. And you have 4 copies of Teferi Time Raveler. Once again, we've already kind of covered most of these cards. Emrakul that was chilling out in the sideboard of the other version is in the main deck. As far as looking at land base, you have 1 Boseiju, 1 Otawaro, a bunch of different fetch lands, shock lands, tri lands. Obviously a bunch of basics to play to be able to play Magus of the Moon, etc. on the sideboard. And then, 4 Wrenn and 6, 4 Teferi, kind of the hallmark of this deck. As far as the sideboard, they're choosing to do a little bit differently. So instead of running a bunch of Endurances, they're choosing to run a bunch of Relics of Progenitus against the various different decks, Murktide, Living End, etc. Instead of playing Mystical Dispute, they're playing Veil of Summer as your resolve spell card. Flusterstorm, good against any of the blue decks, good against Living End, etc. Alpine Moon, once again, good against Tron, okay against Amulet, pretty decent against Living End, not Living End, against Urza's Saga as well. Additional copies of Boseiju. Force of Vigor allows you to answer anything out of Hammer Time and Urza's Saga decks primarily. And, if your opponent's packing Blood Moon, you might want to bring that in. EE we've already kind of covered, along with Urion. This main deck, one difference here is you're playing a couple copies of Dress Down. Very good against Urza's Saga tokens. Can also be good if you time them right against opposing elemental decks and such. You can also play this like in an end step and then, pitch cast your Furies or your Solitudes and have them stick around. So there's a lot of different plays you can do with Dive Down. It's also very good, as I mentioned, against Urza's Saga tokens. Rest of the deck is all things we've seen before. 30 lands seems to be about the normal you see out of these Urion decks. Sideboard, you're seeing a smattering of cards. One difference with this version is a couple copies of Supreme Verdict can come in against any type of tribal or creature-based decks. Then 3 copies of the Chalice of the Void. Notably in this deck, you are not playing a ton of 1-drops, so you can generally play this on turn 2. Or you can play this, bring this in against various Cascade decks, whether it be Rhinos, whether it be Living In, whether it be the new Glimpse Elementals deck. Kind of gives you an out against that. And then once again, Emrakul the Promised End has kind of become regular tech in these decks for go-over-the-top things. So one of the reasons you might see Emrakul the Promised End kind of floating around in a lot of these lists is, much like its 4-color Elemental sister deck, you kind of have to either go under it or over it. You can't battle this in a mid-range pile to pile. This is much like Niv to Light in the Pioneer format without being quite as this deck being much more powerful than that. It's just kind of the king of the mid-range decks. This deck, I've seen it outgrind Blue-White Control, I've seen it outgrind Murktide, I've seen it outgrind Jund, the various different versions, whether it's the Saga version or the new Charm version. You cannot grind with this deck. You have to tempo them or you have to go over the top. Decks like Green Tron, decks like Amulet Titan, or go under them. Decks like Belcher or Burn, or all these different decks can either go under them. Murktide kind of has a closest matchup against them. A lot of it comes down to the skill of the pilots. The Murktide deck has to be the aggressor, as this deck will overwhelm them with card advantage in the mid to late game. Decks like Living End can also be challenging. Any decks that are kind of linear in what they're trying to do and pretty quick to execute can really get under what this deck is trying to do. That said, one of the natures and why this deck can be so difficult to attack is whatever deck this deck wants to beat, it can beat. Between the main and the sideboard, it's going to have the tools to play against anything. If it wants to be Amulet Titan, you got Maguses and Boseijus and counter spells and all these other different things. If it wants to beat Murktide, it has all this removal, it has all these 2-for-1s. If it wants to beat Burn, it can bring in things like Weather the Storm or other life gain things besides Omnath and Solitude. There's all these different things the deck can do, but much like a souped up version of old Jund, it can only beat so many decks, and there will be lists that will catch it off guard in a given week. 1 week Green Tron might overpower it. Another week Living End might catch it off guard. Another week Belcher might catch it off guard. The problem with this deck is it has so many 50-50, 55-45 matchups, and the longer it hangs in the game, the better it is. I've played this deck some off camera. You know, I had a really weird league where I went 2-3, but a lot of it was just inexperience with the deck. I beat Living In and I beat some other pile and lost to like this other Urion like Blink deck that I would have beaten if I wouldn't have timed out. That's one of the things, and that is one of the other things with this deck, is this deck does take a long time to win. Whether you're playing on Magic Online or in paper, you're shuffling an 80-card deck, you're taking all these game actions. You have to be really proficient and quick with the deck, especially in bigger tournament situations. So, one of the reasons you may not see as many versions of this deck, besides it's called Money Pile for a reason, it's the most expensive deck in the format, outside of maybe Elementals, which obviously shares a lot of cards in common with it. But, it's very difficult to play quickly. It does not close out games particularly quickly. It does have some draws that do, don't get me wrong there. And there are ways to attack it. There's no one specific card to attack it. There's no, other than, like, say, Torpor Orb, which is a card that I mentioned against the Elementals deck. This deck does have a lot of ETB effects. Torpor Orb is very good in those situations, but, it is playing Bosages, it is playing Auto Warriors, it is playing March of Otherworldly Light, it's playing Prismatic Ending. It has a lot of outs. Some versions are playing Force of Vigor. This deck has a lot of outs against those things, but it does help in addition to pressure or some other way to go over the top of it. Some versions in this deck historically in the past have eschewed some of the elemental package for more planeswalkers. Jace the Mind Sculptor, Teferi Time Raveler, or Teferi Master or Hero of Dominaria. I can't go through and find every different iteration in the lists. It's just not feasible because this deck has so much fluidity in what it's capable of doing. But the deck is very powerful. It's very strong at what it does, but there are ways to attack it. It may not be the overwhelming behemoth that other people might think it is, and I don't even think it's the number one play deck. I do believe Murktide is still the number one play deck, but there are ways to attack it. Grixis Death Shadow is also making a return as a deck that can kind of hang with this a little bit because it has a nice tempo plan, much like is it Murktide. So this deck is certainly one of the top decks in the format, but it is by no means unbeatable. But this is a deck that's already suffered multiple bans throughout history. It's lost Arkham's Astrolabe. It's lost Uro. It's lost Field of the Dead. This was obviously before some of the pitch elementals, but this is a deck that used to have access to Omnath, Uro. Field of the Dead was one of the top decks in the format for a long time. Was banned right about the same time as Simian Spirit Guide took a chunk out of Neo Brand and Oops All Spells and the original version of Belcher, etc. So this is a deck that was very powerful and has suffered multiple bans, but has gotten multiple powerful cards in it. And it's basically just 4-color good stuff. And when you play a series of powerful cards, you're gonna have a powerful deck. But it's called Money Pile for a reason. It is a deck you need to be aware of how to play against it, what decks are decent against it. Understanding if your opponent has built their sideboard or the main deck in such a way, they might beat you anyway. So I think that's one of the people's big frustrations with this deck is even if you have a deck with a favorable matchup, it can still beat you. It's not like I don't think there's any one matchup with this deck that's like Tron versus Burn or Amulet versus Burn or these overwhelming matchups where like Amulet's really favored against Burn and Tron's very unfavored against Burn. This deck has a lot of middling matchups in the 40 to 60 percentile that a lot of it just based on the cards that it draws or the cards that it has access to. A lot of people don't like that, but this is an infinitely customizable deck that if its pilot knows the meta, has access to the cards, they can beat about anything they want. So, it's about all I got for this deck. A lot of the things we said about 4-color elementals apply to this deck. It's just a little bit, it's choosing to interact on the stack, so it's not as vulnerable to as many things as it's, the Risen Reef pile is, but that version's a little bit even grindier than this version. So, you win some, you lose some, and this deck does take a lot of proficiency to pilot. And, once you have experience with the deck, it can very much be a very rewarding deck. So, this has been John for MTGO Nexus. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Let me know down below what other decks you would like to see in this series, as we've already covered quite a few of them. But we're starting to, pick up the pace, hopefully get a little bit more of these out. So let me know down in the comments, and hope to see you for the next video.